Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much again for joining me. It's wonderful to be with you. And we will be covering today the last part of my lectures, really looking at the 20th century. This is not going to be an easy history, but I think it gives a lot of explanation as to what happened to the Jews during the Second World War, and that's really where we will stop. So this final session will examine the Jews at the beginning of the 20th century, a little about Zionism, the rising antisemitism, the White Terror, and finally the German invasion in March 1944. So let's start with Budapest. Budapest, at the beginning of the 20th century, with its merging Buda, Pest, and Óbuda, was the European city with the largest concentration of Jews next to Warsaw. Its Jewry was organized, as we saw last time, into several Numerus, Orthodox, and status quo congregations, which, like all Jewish congregations in the country, had by law the right of collecting a congregational tax from Jews living within their territory. We saw this map as well last time to really make us understand the places where these different types of communities existed. Only if a Jew officially notified the congregation that he seceded from Judaism was he freed from the onus of paying the congregational tax. By far, the largest congregation was in Budapest. This Neolog Israelite congregation of Pest had approximately 250,000 persons. Budapest maintained no fewer than 42 synagogues, including this huge Dohani synagogue that we saw last time, a network of elementary and intermediate and secondary schools, a library, archives, published books, of course, of religious, cultural, and historical interest. It maintained several hospitals, institutes for the deaf, the mute, and for the blind, orphans' homes for boys and girls, an old people's home, and as you see here, the cemetery in Pest, a Chevra Kadisha, charitable and burial society, and this large cemetery. Let me just say that by the beginning of the 20th century, Jews had achieved leaps and bounds professionally after they had been granted emancipation, as we saw last time. Once medicine opened its doors to Hungarian Jews, it became their favorite specialization, and before long, they were the dominant element among Hungarian physicians. Jews became active also in providing medical and related services to the public and founding hospitals, clinics, and other institutions. They also practiced as lawyers, while others contributed significantly to the development of legal literature. They edited law journals, they filled high posts in the Ministry of Justice, and they taught at the universities and the legal academies. In industry and trade, Jews too advanced. Small-scale industries among the Jews developed to such an extent that when the building of the great Dohani synagogue was taking place, the iron and the brass works for it were done, finally, by some Jewish artisans. Some Jewish post-emancipation became even barons in Hungary. Now just think back to what I said before about this patriotism and how this finally was a sense that they had come home. The recognition was given almost exclusively to men who chalked up extraordinary achievements in industry, in commerce, and in finance. For example, in 1874, the Wodieners were the first Jewish family to be made barons, and here you can see their beautiful home. And here is a picture of himself. A wonderful example of this opulence in Jewish life for me, I feel it whenever I go to Szeged, is this incredible synagogue that gives you the sense of the Jews when they were at their strongest. this absolutely beautiful synagogue, one of the most beautiful and largest synagogues in Europe. I was there last year, taking some of these images from the outside, from the inside. It's the second largest, of course, after the Doheny Synagogue, a jewel in Hungarian art nouveau. And with its Baroque dome that you see here, its Roman columns, its Byzantine-inspired bellows, the monumental building is a hymn to eclecticism. And its mixture of this sort of Rhinish, late Romanesque and Italian Gothic styles provides it with this incredible lightness. Leopold Bamhorn designed a dome with elevated arches, evoking, of course, the dome of the Florence Cathedral. And before him, Imre Steindl had built the same type of dome here, as you can see, in the Hungarian parliament. So again, when you see the Jews creating a synagogue that has the same sort of emblem as the Hungarian parliament building, you have the sense of trying to identify with them. And the clear reference, I think, expressed identification with the country and triumph of Hungarian Jewish existence in a powerful way. On each side of the Szeged Synagogue, you have these beautiful stained glass windows, here emphasizing, of course, the importance of Shabbat, and here emphasizing the temple in Jerusalem. And the son of the rabbi, Leopold, who lived between 1811 and 1875, who'd been the main propagator and theoretical founder of the Hungarian Jewish neology, Chief Rabbi Emanuel Lehr, that you see here, demonstrated his passion for botany and inspired the floral motifs of the decor. A few words then about Zionism at this time. I think it is one of the paradoxes in the history of Hungarian Jewry that on one hand, the precursors, the founders of the Zionist movement arose from the ranks of Hungarian Jewry. And on the other, it produced the most fervent opposition to Zionism and provided the smallest contingents to rally around its flag. Hungarian Jewish opposition to Zionism was motivated by two factors, as I write here. A conviction that the Jews, or at any rate Hungarian Jews, were not a race, not a people, not an ethnic group, not a nationality, because these things made them not fit into the Hungarian society, but purely and solely a religious denomination of Hungary was why they were so against Zionism. But I think it was also this emotional reaction against Zionism as well. They wanted to remain in Hungary, having achieved the emancipation that was so important to them. And the fact that was that in the 50 years of its pre-state history, Zionism attracted only a small percentage of Hungarian Jews. And you can go in Pest and see this exhibition of what a Hungarian Zionist flat or apartment would have looked like. Walk through it and see the sorts of pamphlets that he would have been exposed to. This was a rare case, definitely some, but not as many as you would expect in Eastern Europe as a Zionist. And when Theodor Herzl argued in 1902 that the Hungarians did not want to recognize the Jews as Hungarians, Miksa Salborski, the editor of the weekly Equality magazine, the most influential Hungarian Jewish weekly, retorted the following: "We are not Hungarian in order to be liked by others, but are Hungarians because our heart, our feeling is Hungarian, because we cannot be anything else, because we do not want to be anything else. The love of the fatherland often breaks through without our wanting it, because it has become our blood, because it has struck its roots in our hearts. How can you reconcile a new nationalist idea with this deeply, deep love of the fatherland?" And Herzl replied the following: "I want to spread the idea of the creation of the Jewish state, he said, "But I shall not insist upon it in Hungary." And he went on to utter the prophetic words that have since then often been quoted. "Before long, you will have such an anti-Semitism in Hungary that compared to it, our Austrian anti-Semitism will seem like nothing. In any case, you will become ours, and anti-Semitism will drive you into our arms." And just to give you that sense when you're walking around Budapest, obviously this is the place where Herzl himself was born, and you see that on some of the remaining plaques, that this was the area specifically that we need to relate to as being connected to his early life. And let me state that in no period in their long history did Hungarian Jews feel as much at home in the Hazar, in the fatherland, as much at one with their Christian Magyar compatriots, as in the half century between their emancipation and the end of World War I. They were on their way to becoming the most educated, intellectual, and well-to-do element in the country. They were honored for their services by court councilorships, as we saw, knighthood, and the baronial rank granted by the gracious King Emperor. The 25 years between the 1895 law of reception granting equality to the Jewish religion and the Numerus Clausus law of 1920 that I'm going to talk about in a moment was the only period in the millennial history of Hungarian Jews when legally no distinction whatsoever existed between the Jewish and the non-Jewish population of the country. The number of the Jews in Hungary rapidly increased. Their economic conditions were on the rise. Their success in industry, commerce, and finance, as we know, were remarkable. Yet after the outbreak of World War I, and especially from 1915, the economic situation in the country deteriorated again. Consumer goods were in short supply, and the hiding and the hoarding of merchandise and black market operations increased, not without Jewish participation. The Jews were now accused of chief responsibility for the abuses in connection with war contacts. One of the scandals was the supply of inferior cloth that the Jews had provided for army uniforms. And this, by the way, also happened in the American Civil War, where Jews were accused of providing what was called shoddy material for the soldiers' uniform. During the First World War, many more Galician Jews fleeing the Russian advance on the Eastern Front had actually managed also to enter Hungary. And the appearance in the capital of a large number of Yiddish-speaking, kaftan-clad, bearded, sidelocked Jews, conspicuously foreign in appearance, fueled the arguments of the anti-Semites that the rise in prices and the lack of consumer goods was due to this inundation of the country by Galician Jews. This was not helped by the fact that the Hungarian Jewish leaders themselves stressed the distinction between them, Magyars, and these Galician Jews. They even used the term Galiciana as an epithet of contempt. So now, of course, we have to turn to the topic of anti-Semitism in Hungary. In 1918, the People's Party, a typical clerical conservative party supported by the Catholic Church, the pro-Habsburg aristocracy, and the great landowners, posing as this bulwark against what was portrayed as the anti-Christian and destructive ideas inherent in liberalism and socialism, as well as the Christian Socialist Party, merged into a party now called the Christian Socialist People's Party and intensified its anti-Jewish agitation. Anti-Semitic books, articles proliferated, and the thickening of the anti-Jewish atmosphere was unmistakable. And so our Hungarian Jews, who had seen their service in the army as an opportunity to demonstrate their patriotism, they had fought this by continuing to take pride in being Hungarian soldiers and fighting side by side with Christian Magyars. For the first time in their history, the presence of Jews in the army was officially recognized and acknowledged by the appointment of rabbis who could be these camp clergymen, as you see here, to take care of their spiritual needs as Jews, just as Catholic and Protestant clergymen did for their denominations. All in all, some 300,000 Jews served in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I, and of them, 25,000 were officers. Many in all the ranks were decorated for bravery. No fewer than 25 Jews or ex-Jews were generals. Jews also played a leading role in financing the war. But of course, fake war statistics would be used by the anti-Semites, as they were in Germany, to support their claim that the Jews had shown a less than total patriotic commitment to the war. And as we know, the results of the First World War brought about a complete reshaping of Central Europe, with the disappearance of the Habsburg dual monarchy and the emergence of new nation states. Of all the Central Powers defeated in World War I, Hungary fared the worst. After the defeat, Hungary lost 71% of its historical territory, so you see it goes from green to pink, and with it 60% of its population, which before the war had stood at 20.9 million. Especially rankling was this readjustment of the borderline between Hungary and Austria on the left, her erstwhile partner in the dual monarchy, which took away the Burgenland, composed of 3 western counties, and gave it to Austria. Hungary thus becomes the only defeated country that lost territory not only to the victors, but also to its former ally and sister state. Of the 3.3 million Hungarians who thus came under foreign rule, 438,000 of them were Jews. This number, 438,000, represented 48% of the total pre-war Hungarian Jewish population of 911,000. Then, the 4 months of the 1919 Communist Council Republic left a lasting impression on the Hungarian mind. The prominent role a few ex-Jews played in the communist leadership was generalized, and the Jews became associated with communism in Hungary as they had in Germany. And this resulted in a marked increase in anti-Semitic sentiment and prepared the ground for the excesses of the White Terror. So now we should turn to this White Terror. White was the designation by which the Hungarian nationalist, rightist, anti-communist forces identified themselves in 1919 forwards. The most significant faction was the National Army, headed by Vice Admiral Miklos Hauti, whom I mentioned last time, which, although it consisted only of officers and non-commissioned officers, was the only Hungarian army armed formation. And this was the period when dozens of outstanding Hungarian intellectuals, scholars, scientists, and artists, many of them Jews, some of them ex-Jews because they'd converted, who were in one way or another associated with the communist regime, even if only remotely, such as by having been appointed to university positions, were either forced to leave the country or left on their own in fear for their lives. For the Jews, the time of the White Terror was a period of severe affliction. The government contributed its share by ordering numerous arrests and prosecutions. And in the eyes of the National Army, Jews were identified with the communism, and cleansing the country of communists meant liquidating the Jews. Especially tragic was what happened in Siófok, the seat of the National Army Command. It was here that the cruelest acts of slaughters were carried out. On the night of August the 27th, 1919, 42 persons were murdered in a forest on the outskirts of the town. And during the period between August the 13th and the end of September 1919, about 200 persons were murdered in the town and in the vicinity. On November 1919, after the Romanian troops left the capital, Horthy, at the head of the National Army, entered Budapest. But he refused to issue general orders for the protection of the Jews. Béla Somogyi, that you see here, a socialist, politician and publisher, also a converted Jew, and Béla Baggio, another journalist and socialist leader, both associated with the socialist paper, The People's Voice, were murdered in February 1920. How did the Jews respond to this? Well, a leading role in Jewish defense against the White Terror was taken by Vilmos Vazony, who was the most outstanding Jew in Hungarian politics at this time. And at the request of various groups in the Jewish community, in August 19, Vazony published a call to the Hungarian public, which decried the persecution of innocent people for the sins committed by communists of Jewish origin. He was not afraid to spill out the sins of Hungarian society, nor sharply to decry anti-Semitism. Unlike, I would say, any other spokesman for official Jewry, who regarded the current anti-Jewish trend as a passing phase, Vazony considered anti-Semitism to be a planned program, not a spontaneous outburst. And the charge of communists hurled against the Jews was merely a pretext. But what the Jews were not prepared for was what was to come next. An official government act in the form of a passage of the first anti-Jewish law in Hungary. It was Law 1920, number 25, which became known as the Numerus Clausus law, the first legal restriction imposed on the Jews of Hungary for generations. And let us recall how hard the Jews of Hungary had fought to get emancipation only a few decades earlier. The purpose of the Numerus Clausus law, when combined with the ministerial order of August 1920, was to reduce the fraction of Jewish students at the Hungarian institutions of higher learning to 5%. There was also a new anti-Semitic organization, what was known as the Awakening Magyars. And as a political organization, this body encompassed the extremist right elements, and during the first half of the 1920s carried considerable political weight. Its leaders were prominent in public and parliamentary affairs and were to be found in positions of authority in the government and the army. The Awakening Magyars also contained a secret military element, which was in fact an armed military organization. In April 1922, their terrorists attacked a Budapest liberal club, most of whose members were Jews. A bomb was planted in the building, timed to explode during a festive dinner to be attended by prominent figures in political life, including former minister Vazony and the liberal leader Karol Lee Rasse. And the latter two, together with other dignitaries, arrived late and thus were saved, but 9 Jews were killed in the explosion and 23 were seriously injured. 2 perpetrators were sentenced to death. The rest were imprisoned for periods of between 5 and 10 years. Only 1 was executed. In March 1923, a series of Jew beatings took place at the Veterinary College in Budapest, which forced the authorities to close it. The dean of the medical faculty, Dr. Károly Hall, demanded that the Israelite congregation of Pest put at the disposal of the school, for the purpose of dissection, the unclaimed bodies of Jewish patients who had died in hospitals, or else he would deny instruction to Jewish medical students. So this pull, this tightening, and this inability of Jews to comfortably study in universities anymore is even being felt here. And the demand was supported also by the Szeged University, causing a sharp controversy with the Szeged Jewish community, which objected, invoking the Jewish tradition to bury bodies intact, which Jewish law demands, and denying the competence of the university to rule in the question. Finally, the Minister of Religion intervened, reserving for himself the right of decision, but not before many additional attacks on Jewish students had been perpetrated. And it's not really surprising, I think, at this point to understand that Jewish organizations outside Hungary are looking in and want to get involved and support the Jewish communities. Dr. Nachum Goldman, the European representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and the British Jewish leader, Lucian Wolff, secretary of the Joint Foreign Committee of the British Board of Jewish Deputies and the Anglo-Jewish Association, came to the conclusion that the Numerus Clausus law had to be mitigated or at least modified so as to assuage the Hungarian Jews and satisfy the demands of Western Jewry, as well as to forestall any action by the League of Nations. But the surprising and shocking thing for us was the stubborn refusal of the Hungarian Jews for outside help. The official Hungarian Jewish leadership actually objected to the Jewish intervention against the Numerus Clausus law at the League of Nations. And they said the following: "We do not invoke the Treaty of Trianon," said Vilmos Vazony in 1924. "We do not understand how to be a national minority, which would place itself under the protection of Geneva." And one reason for this attitude was that the leaders regarded the Numerus Clausus as an internal matter. Was this then through fear? And not surprisingly, it was the younger generation who now choose to leave the country. Thousands of Jewish high school graduates who were not admitted to the Hungarian higher educational network because of the Numerus Clausus law now sought university education in other countries. It was a blessing in disguise, as without it, and this is going back to our apartment of the Zionist, I think it seems likely that the modest growth of the Zionist movement in Hungary as a result of the Numerus Clausus law and of the emigration of Hungarian Jews to Palestine would have been smaller. So the Numerus Clausus law gives this, in effect, a chance for Jews to come to Palestine from Hungary. And from Hungary as a whole, some 44,500 Jews emigrated, or 5.3% of the total Jewish population at that time. And as we can see, what the Hungarian Jewish position amounted to was in effect a self-isolation from the Jewries of other countries and a claim that the relationship of the Hungarian Jews to Hungary was more intimate, more closely knit than that of other Jews to other countries. And so we come to the 1930s. Let us start by asking the difference between Germany and Hungary. Similar anti-Semitism agitation is taking place in Germany at this time. The Beer Hall Putsch had taken place. But in Germany, anti-Semitism ran up against the democratic government of the Weimar Republic. But in Hungary, anti-Semites in opposition were actually already succeeding in penetrating the national political organs and local administrations, so that the official policy became that of the governmental system of which anti-Semitism was already an essential part. And this means that we face two new Jewish laws in 1938 and 1939. The first Jewish law of 1938 introduced an entirely new and never before experienced dimension into the issue of Hungarian Jewish identification. First to be attacked were the performing arts. Law 1938, or 15 as it was called, ordered that the Ministry of the Interior should set up a chamber of the press and a chamber of theatrical and film arts, and only individuals accepted as members of these chambers were to be allowed to work in these fields. And subsequent paragraphs of the law limited Jews to 20% of the number engaged in various capacities, in all kinds of commercial and other films, and then importantly, limited the total salaries paid to all Jewish white-collar workers to 20% of the salaries paid to non-Jewish white-collar workers. And this law was a much more serious blow to the Jewish community of Hungary than the Numerus Clausus law of 1920 had been. The Numerus Clausus law only affected the planned careers of Jewish high school graduates. This one of 1938, deprived tens of thousands of Jews long established in their professions, in their jobs, and in their livelihoods. Its avowed purpose was to alleviate unemployment among the Christian Magyar professionals, and the method it adopted was to create unemployment among Jewish Magyar professionals. But stubbornly, the Jewish leadership again rejected, as it had in connection with the Numerus Clausus law, all interference on the part of Western Jewish organizations. And in the meantime, Hungary becomes more and more attached, but also subordinated to the expansionist ideas and policies of Hitler's Germany. Before the end of 1938, now headed by a new right-wing Prime Minister, Bela Emredi, that you see here, it prepared an additional bill aiming at further limiting Jewish participation in the country's economic and social life. The bill, as it became law on May the 5th, 1939, Law 1939, number 4, popularly known as the Second Jewish Law, is a very long document and evinced a definite affinity with the German racial laws. It excluded Jews from all public office, both state and municipal. It dismissed Jewish teachers from all schools, except those maintained by Jewish congregations. It limited Jewish membership in the chambers of lawyers, engineers, physicians, the press, theatre and film to about 6% of the total. Jews are now barred from acquiring plots of land for the erection of private residences larger than 600 square cubits. The 1938 and 1939 laws were devastating blows to Hungarian Jews, both economically but also psychologically. Economically, because tens of thousands were thrown out of work, and psychologically, because these laws suddenly deprived them of a mainstay of their Hungarian identity. The trauma that these two laws caused to Hungarian Jewry was extremely severe, much worse than anything they had lived through in prior centuries. Now they had to rethink their own position in Hungary, something of which most Hungarian Jews were simply incapable of doing. And Rabbi Shimon Chevesi, the leading chief rabbi of the Israelite congregation of Pest, exhorted the community to show endurance and to bear the trials with patience. Emanuel, the chief rabbi of Szeged, believed that the law would be short-lived. But what none of the Jewish leaders took into account was that this time it was the Hungarian parliament representing the will of the nation that had acted against the Jews, and that it did so under the pressure of Hitler's Germany, where institutionalized and legalized anti-Semitism had by this time been established, of course, for several years. On January the 12th, 1939, the central office of the three nationwide Jewish communal organizations, the Synagogue, the Orthodox, and the status quo Jews, jointly appealed to the government and pointed out that the bill violated the Hungarian constitution, its equality before the law, and the protection of acquired rights. But by this time, really out of desperation, Hungarian Jewish leadership solicited aid from international Jewish organizations that they had stubbornly refused before, primarily from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. But in the course of 1941, Hungary was gradually and irresistibly drawn into the war by Germany. So, as you have all realized, it was also pressure from the Germans on the Hungarian government to conform its own treatment of the Jews to that of Germany. In Hungary, the third Jewish law was promulgated on August 2nd, 1941, Law Number 15. Its official title was about the completion and modification of the 1894-21 law dealing with marriage rights, as well as about race-protecting dispositions necessary in connection therewith. Its central provision is stated in the very first sentence of Section 9. A non-Jew is forbidden to enter into marriage with a Jew. It also punished with 3 years' imprisonment any Jewish man who had extramarital sexual relations with a decent non-Jewish woman resident in Hungary. And simultaneously with the issuance of the third Jewish law began the deportation of Jews from Hungary. The first to be affected were foreign Jews, variously estimated from about 15,000 to 35,000, who had fled in 1938 from the territories occupied by Germany and found refuge in Hungary. They were transported to eastern Galicia, most of them to Kamenets-Podolsk, others to Transnistria, a separatist enclave on the east bank of the Dniester River. And in contrast to the foreign Jews, the Jews who were Hungarian citizens had a respite of 3 more years. They were degraded, deprived of their jobs and livelihood, and made miserable in every respect, but they were neither killed outright nor deported at this time to death camps. But the able-bodied Jewish men were now forced to serve in labor battalions. That summer, 11 such battalions were sent to northern Hungary to work on the roads leading across the Carpathian Mountains. Others were put to work to help out with harvesting. They had to wear a yellow armband, and their papers were stamped with a red ZS for Zidel, for being a Jew. They were often treated in a very cruel manner that was designed to kill them. The Hungarian government was also not able to prevent Hungarian military and gendarmerie units from carrying out mass slaughters in the south, especially around Novi Sad, the Hungarian Újvidék, where thousands of Serbs and Jews were put to death as supposed partisans. Between January the 21st and the 23rd of 1942, 2 Hungarian high army officials claiming that Serbs had made attacks against the Hungarian army carried out identity checks on all the inhabitants of Budapest. They went from house to house. They ordered many Serbs and Jews, Hungarian Jews who'd remained loyal to Hungary, to gather on the banks of the Danube. There, they were forced to undress. They were lined up. They were led them to wait in the great cold for many hours, and then they were shot, and they fell into the river. According to German documents, Several thousands fell victim to this massacre, and a statement by the Hungarian Minister of the Exterior actually reported that 3,755 had been killed. Finally, the civilian authorities of Ójvidék contacted Budapest, and an order was issued to stop the killing. I'm going to continue this history, but looking at what happens to the Jews by the Hungarians more than studying the brutality of the Germans, who will only arrive in Hungary in 1944. In October 1942, in a note addressed to the Hungarian government, the Germans demanded that Hungary remove its Jews from the economic and cultural life of Hungary, forcing them now to wear a yellow Star of David, and beginning their deportation forthwith, as was already in progress in neighbouring countries. But in its response, in December 1942, the Hungarian government refused to comply, pointing to the severe legal restrictions that had already been imposed upon the Jews, arguing that their treatment was an internal Hungarian affair, and that their resettlement would disrupt the Hungarian economy, 80% of which was now in the service of Germany. And Miklos Kálay de Nagykálló serves as Prime Minister of Hungary during World War II from March 1942 to March 1944, when the Germans arrived. Kálay maintained that the solution of the Jewish question in Hungary would be extremely difficult because the fraction of Jews was much larger than that in other European countries. And he emphasized that as far as their international influence was concerned, the Hungarian Jews were much less dangerous than the Jews of France, he said, and that, quote, the solution of the question would be difficult also because, for example, the Hungarian peasant was absolutely not anti-Semitic. By the end of 1943, the Germans recognized that the mood in Hungary was turning against them, that they were being independent, they weren't following the rules, and concluded that in order to prevent its succession, they had to occupy it. And it is almost incredible that whilst the final solution was in full swing in neighboring countries and in Hungary herself, the Jewish condition was precipitously deteriorating, with brutal physical attacks on the Jews increasing. Jewish educational and cultural institutions continued to function relatively undisturbed. More cultural activities took place under Jewish auspices afterwards than while the Hungarian Jews were still a prosperous, well-established, socially and economically secure community. It would be erroneous to interpret this phenomenon as indicating that Hungarian Jewry was oblivious to the catastrophe that had overtaken the Jews in the adjacent countries. It seems rather to reflect what I think are two interconnected reactions. One, as I write here, was defiance. The Jews, who for decades had been leaders in every field of Hungarian culture, felt impelled to show that despite everything done to them by the anti-Semitic government, they were determined to continue in the same role. But the other was sort of more naive belief in the special relationship between Hungarian Jews and the Hungarian people. However much the Hungarians hurt the Jews, it was simply impossible to them that the genocide, or to believe that the genocide undertaken by Germany in the neighboring countries would actually spread to Hungary. It could not happen here, they thought. And it was largely due to Kálay and Horthy's refusal to go along with the German policy of the final solution that Hungarian Jewry as a whole was able to survive with only incidental and occasional loss of life until the beginning of the German organized deportations of May the 15th, 1944. And of the roughly 775,000 Jews in Hungary on the eve of the German occupation of March the 19th, 1944, around 175,000 were concentrated in Budapest and 600,000 lived in the country towns. The number of communities outside Budapest was about 360. Most were Orthodox, then neology, and the least was status quo. There were Jewish elementary schools, yeshivas, and high schools everywhere. The official Jewish leadership pronouncements of the leading rabbis and the heads of the communities were unanimous in counseling. Patience, wait, endure, bide one's time. And it was only shortly before the German occupation that some Orthodox Jews voiced this conclusion as seen in a Hebrew writing published in Budapest in 1944 under the title Ein Habanim Smecha, the mother of the son rejoices, by Rabbi Teichtal, which advocated readiness for emigration and even reproached the Orthodox leadership for having been tardy in recognizing this necessity. Only 6,000 Jews were able to escape from Hungary between 1939 and 1944 and find refuge in Palestine. And to say that March the 19th, 1944 was the beginning of the most catastrophic year in the 18 centuries of Jewish history in Hungary does not even begin to convey the fact that the Holocaust perpetrated by the Germans and Hungarians that year was not only on an entirely different order of magnitude from any persecution Hungarian Jews had experienced before, but was also of a totally different kind. Never before had they been singled out for total extermination by the government of the country of which they were citizens or legal inhabitants. So let's take a look at what was happening in Hungary at the moment the Germans arrived on March the 19th, 1944. We should note the creation of the Arrow-Cross Party, a far-right Hungarian ultra-nationalist party led by Ferenc Szalasi, which will form a government in Hungary called the Government of National Unity, and they were in power from the 15th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. It will play a fateful part in the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. Szalasi was an army officer, and like many of his contemporaries, a man of extreme rightist views who desired to restore Hungary to its former glory. In 1935, Szalasi had retired from the army, and he had founded a political group called the Party of National Will, out of which the Arrow-Cross subsequently emerged. And it is in the light of this follower mentality that we must understand the Hungarian support of the Holocaust after the German occupation of Hungary on March the 19th. We know the drill. Adolf Eichmann's plan was to round up Jews first in the northern border areas of Hungary, then in the east, in the south, and then the west. Budapest was left to last. The evacuation of the Jews was carried out with great brutality by the police and the gendarmerie. The conditions in the ghettos were appalling, purposely made as inhumane as possible. And when you're in Pest and you're walking around, you can see where the ghetto started and where it finished. Tens of thousands of Jews, and this is another memorial, were crowded into small areas, maltreated, savagely beaten, in search of hidden valuables, subjected to starvation, and deprived of the most elementary sanitary facilities. This is the wall of the Budapest ghetto that you can see here, and this is what is written on its plaque. On May the 15th, 1944, Eichmann began to organize and carry out the actual deportations outside of Budapest. Within 8 weeks, a total of around 458,000 were sent to their death in Auschwitz. And as the deportation of Jews from the Hungarian provinces proceeded more or less according to the German plan and schedule, Eichmann began preparations for liquidating the Jews of the Budapest ghetto as well. The number of Jews in the Hungarian capital before the war was around 200,000. But since the German occupation began, even though Jews were forbidden to travel, many had risked what they thought would be imprisonment and had taken a train to Budapest because they thought they would be safer there. And consequently, the number of Jews concentrated in the capital by the summer of 1944 is estimated to have been between 250,000 and 280,000. Each successive attempt to deport the Budapest Jews had been foiled so far, especially since Germany was already on the retreat. It didn't have the capacity to organize the trains to get the Jews of Budapest to Auschwitz. But early in January 1945, the Arrow Cross, together with the Germans, planned to liquidate the Budapest ghetto totally by killing all its surviving inmates. By January the 15th, there were 1,500 SS men, 200 policemen, and 22 armed Arrow Cross officers ready for action. But it was too close to Germany's defeat. Selassie contacted the SS command, and he warned August Schmidtruber, the SS brigade Führer, that the annihilation of the ghetto would mean his being tried and condemned, not as a soldier, but as a mass murderer after the war. The general heeded the warning, and he put a stop to the planned action. Selassie left Hungary on April the 4th, 1945, a few days before the total liberation of the country, taking with him the royal crown, the most venerated emblem of the Hungarian state. Adolf Eichmann continued, together with the Arrow Cross, the drive against the Jews. And consequently, in those last 2 months before the Russian occupation of Budapest, some 10 to 15,000 Jews were shot into the icy waters of the Danube or in the streets of the city. On January the 18th, 1945, when Soviet unions liberated the Budapest ghetto, some 70,000 persons were found alive in it. In addition, between 10,000 and 25,000 Jews were saved in protected houses, and an unknown number survived in hiding in various parts of the city. All in all, it can be estimated that about 119,000 Jews survived the Nazi Holocaust in Budapest, about half the number who lived in the city before the outbreak of the war. By the end of the Holocaust, some 565,000 Hungarian Jews had been murdered. And here we see one of the memorials to the Jews of the Holocaust just behind the Dohany Synagogue. There were about 20,000 Hungarian concentration camp survivors and 5,000 forced laborers survivors. And from over 800,000 Jews living within Hungary's borders in 1941 to 1944, about 255,500 are thought to have survived, which means about 31% of the Hungarian Jewish population survived the Holocaust. And there are, by the way, memorials to see, not only in Budapest, but as you see here, also in Szeged and Sopron. This is also showing the empty pews in the synagogue, in the Holocaust Memorial in Budapest, to give you the real sense of some of the personal stories of some of the Jews who were sitting in these seats before the war. And here you can see. So I want to finish our series together, if I may, with the Shoe Memorial, something that I knew a lot about before I went, and something that really made a big impression to me, and I want to share with you some of the images of it and what the memorial actually means. On the banks of the Danube River in Budapest, not far from the Hungarian Parliament building, sit 60 pairs of old-fashioned shoes, the type people wore in the 1940s. Each of the shoes are different. Some have worn down heels, and then there are the tiny shoes of children. They are a memorial and a monument to the Hungarian Jews who in the winter of 1944 to 45 were shot on the banks of the Danube River by the members of the Arrow Cross Party. The monument was installed on the Pest bank of the Danube River in 2005. Shooting the Jews into the Danube was convenient because the river carried the bodies away. Often the Arrow Cross murderers would force their terrified Jewish victims to remove their shoes before shooting them into the Danube. Shoes, after all, were a valuable commodity during World War II. The killers could use them or trade them on the black market. Sometimes the Arrow Cross pulled the shoestrings out of the children's shoes and used them to tie the helpless Jewish victims' hands together before they were shot. Sometimes they used rope instead. Most of the children died immediately because the water, of course, was freezing cold. So we've spent 4 sessions together learning the history of the Jews of Hungary, and I want to conclude with a few ideas. This has been a difficult history. The active dislike of the Jews that characterized large segments of the Hungarian people and that enabled Hungarian commanders to rely on many in the ranks of the gendarmerie, the police and the army to carry out the deportation and mass murder of Jews with unrestrained brutality, while the public at large stood by with indifference and held the Jews only in a few exceptional cases. The success of the extreme right, its influence over Hungarian politics, enabled the Germans, of course, to pursue a policy of comparatively moderate intervention with regard to the Jewish question. Antisemitism was ripe in Hungary, as it had been in Poland. But there is something else, the blind patriotism of the Jews, which blinded them to the inexorable progression of deadly antisemitism. The official leaders of the Hungarian Jews, and especially those in the capital, Budapest, remained convinced to the very last moment that, quote, "it can't happen here." So I think we should end with the words of Elie Wiesel. Although, of course, he was a Romanian Jew, he always felt Hungarian. He spoke Hungarian and Yiddish at home. And this is what he said. "What is typical is the naive confidence, the utter faith that most Jews placed in the friendship towards them of the Hungarian people and government, particularly in the last but one phase of their coexistence after emancipation, what I spoke about in both my third and today lectures. Despite Hungary's classical, more or less anti-Jewish legislation, we were convinced that the country's supreme authorities would never sacrifice us to Nazi Germany's insane ambitions." And I think that principle, or the feeling of Jewish otherness, was to remain, despite all subsequent developments, a determining factor in Jewish-Christian relations in Hungary, from where we started in our first session, down, of course, to the destruction in the 20th century. Thank you, everybody, for joining me.